Hello there. Have you ever heard of or played Tom Clancy's The Division? You probably have because you clicked on this video, and well, both of these games have occupied that unique spot of amazing game and frustrating crap at the same time for me over the years. Now, before you run to the comments and tear me a new one for dissing your favorite thing ever, stick around and join me for however long it takes to share my experiences and thoughts on both of the games in this franchise, as well as a short wish list of what I would like to see in The Division 3, which was announced to be in development back in September 2023. I am Dr. Ursa, and I talk about things I like and hope that you will like me in return. Let's start at the beginning with The Division 1, which launched onto the 8th generation of consoles and PC back in March of 2016. Now, unlike many of you, this game caught me completely by surprise. I was just a lowly redshirt back in my retail employment days, and I put up the new release signing for this game the week it came out. That was the first I had heard of it, and I even got this neat little flash drive with my purchase. I picked up a copy because it looked cool, and holy shit, I fell in love. I had played Borderlands, I had played Mass Effect, but nothing had mixed the RPG and looter-shooter mechanics in such a fascinating way to me before this game. I was in deep immediately. I was also lucky enough that several of my online friends picked this one up around the same time, but I will always remember the moments where my brother and I were facing some challenging missions as a duo and really struggling against the bullet sponge enemies the first game became famous for as extra special compared to the rest. The Division stood out because it broke the usual Tom Clancy formula to this point of hyper-lethal weapons and realistic physics and reactions. That isn't to say that typical shooter mechanics don't still show up. Headshots do more damage than center mass, but you will pump more than one magazine into most enemies, and better just get used to it now. It does not mean that you cannot become powerful, however, as in-game builds tended to focus around raw burst damage in my personal experiences. We will get into this a bit more when discussing the endgame, but know that this franchise suffers from the classic MMO problem where more DPS tends to be the most efficient answer. Immersion or class fantasy be damned. Now, before we dive down any of those rabbit holes, let's discuss what the first game is and how it tried to shake up the looter-shooter landscape, for better or worse. Tim Charles' The Division is a third-person looter-shooter with RPG-like mechanics baked into the gear and leveling system. This means that you will start at level 1 and work your way up to level 30, with gear and stats growing more powerful as you go. At a surface level, this follows the classic formula of gear color representing rarity and power, in that you can trust purple items will be stronger than any blues or greens. These do scale with your level, and you eventually face a slightly more cluttered gear score based grind once you get to max level. But if you just keep comparing the new stuff with what you are wearing, you should be able to determine what will serve you best along the way. Now, there are dozens or even hundreds of build videos out there for both games, so I will not be diving into those particulars here. Also, anything that you see on screen is from my old Xbox account or my recently created Steam account for the second game, and I am far from optimal in either. It has been many years since I have chased the meta or put together a build, but I still love these games and remember some of the struggle. At this point, I boot up the first game at least 1 or 2 times a year to play around a survival, which I have an earlier video on if you want to check it out. But I picked up the sequel on PC a while back with a couple of my bros, and we've spent the past few months trying to catch up compared to our old console accounts. I don't like to really engage in console wars or the PC versus console debate, but even I would be an asshole if I pretended that mouse control has not made me twice as lethal. The most unique aspect of these games is the PvEvP nature of the epically named Dark Zone. This was a completely lost and uncontrolled area in the center of New York City in the first game, and allowed players or groups to declare themselves as rogue and able to fight and kill non-rogue players. This was watered down significantly in the sequel, but at the danger of repeating myself, we'll cover that in a bit when we dig into Tony Clarence's The Division 2 overall. I was there in the early days of the Div 1 Dark Zone 2, back when the way to trigger rogue status was to just start unloading on someone. They eventually changed this so that players had to hold a button to trigger rogue, but some of the early days of battling 8v8 or more in the alleyways without anyone even attempting to extract were something special in their own chaotic way. I was usually on the anti-rogue side, but I can't pretend like we didn't take advantage of numerical superiority more than once. Oh well, loot is loot, and the Dark Zone is the Dark Zone. So I mentioned that these games are looter shooters. and this means that you are always picking up goodies from your defeated enemies. There's a decent amount of variety, but I do not remember the exact meta of different patches as well as they used to. This was the main way that the RPG aspects of the game were shown, in that everything from armor to your weapons would provide various stats that would equal your overall build. The Division 1 focused around 3 primary statistics in firearms, stamina, and electronics. Shorthand, those equal damage, health, and skills, and there were a few different build options out there, but damage almost always ended up being supreme. To elaborate a bit, this was mostly due to certain enemies being able to jam or counter your skills, which featured things such as deployable turrets, scanning pulses, and even a single-shot explosive launcher amongst others. At the end of the day, not as much will stop you from unloading your weapons into an enemy, so when in doubt, just lean into becoming a glass cannon. I personally became a fan of the shield skill and a gear set that let me use my SMGs with the shield. That was the closest I ever got to a tank build at any point, but I tried out a few different focuses throughout the years, with a slight fondness for the era of M1A supremacy sticking out in my memory. You would eventually find yourself grinding out the same missions you played throughout the story/leveling experience at endgame, but with a new focus on getting those perfectly rolled loot drops, aka the God Roll. On and on into infinity as you forever chase that slightly better version of your gear. The setting of The Division features a post-pandemic America that found itself crippled by a man-made variant of smallpox that was spread via infected paper money on Black Friday. Pretty insidious stuff, and this was well before the collective trauma that is COVID reared its ugly head. I know it's not really the same, but I do always wonder if this story would have been a bit more cynical if they knew what we know now. This virus, dubbed the Green Poison, wreaks havoc on most population centers, leading to the activation of Directive 51, which calls into service sleeper agents amongst the regular population that have been specially chosen to operate outside of the usual parameters and do whatever is necessary to establish a continuity of society and government for the United States of America. Hoorah and whatnot. I have seen a lot of people paint this as some sort of evil plan over the years, and even had someone make an argument that our agent is no worse than any cop or politician abusing their position right to my face. But I also know that the guy I took through New York was stopping escaped prisoners and mercenaries from burning civilians to death with flamethrowers, so maybe take your soapbox to some other series. Thanks. You are an agent of the second wave, which means you have only been called in because things have really gone tits up. The first wave has either all deserted their post, or even worse, gone rogue in a desperate bid to survive. This sees the player agent starting out in Brooklyn and reporting to a coordinator for the Division. After some introductory missions, you go to meet with the newly appointed commander of the second wave, only to see his Osprey dropship get blown to smithereens right in front of you and fellow agent Fei Lao. This is the setup for your insertion into Manhattan and the main map for the first game. You start out by establishing a base of operations for all future missions across this devastated version of New York City. Now, I've only ever driven through this pinnacle of urban sprawl, and do not claim to know my way around, but holy shit did this game immerse you into its unique version of this American icon. The Green Poison has devastated the general population of America, and has something like a 90% mortality rate with only roughly 5% of people being immune. Really think about those numbers for a moment, and realize that most everyone you know might have succumbed to this illness if this was all real. It's scary stuff, honestly. Look, we all have more experience than any of us plan for, or deserve, when it comes to pandemics at this point, but this was a pretty novel idea back in 2016. With a believable origin story revolving around the madness of Black Friday, the entire plot was just on this side of believable and was elevated due to this in my opinion. Once your agent has established their HQ, they set out to recruit various assets across the city. This leads to the various section heads of Roy Benitez, Jessica Candle, and Paul Rhodes, and these individuals will help establish a sense of normalcy, as well as unlocking the various features of the BOO. You continue this pattern all the way up to maximum level, and then you would set out repeating all of the various missions, hoping for better and better loot. They continued this for a while, and eventually began introducing new mission types and DLCs down the road. This began with various balancing updates and patches, then transitioned into our first new feature, Incursions. I will fully admit that my friends and I definitely clipped through the wall on Falcon Lost at least once or twice, but once the community learned to just huddle down in the tunnel, things became a lot more manageable. The various DLC episodes all introduced some new game mode or update. Underground added in a roguelite system of mostly randomly generated rooms strung together, ending in a tough encounter against a new enemy type, hunters. Survival, which is my personal favorite, added in a PvEvP Battle Royale style mode that would see you dropped into an instance version of the map, with a time limit forcing you to reach the center of the DZ and extract with loot crates to be opened once you are safely back at base. Everyone started from scratch and built themselves up throughout the match, and this was one of those love it or hate it additions to the game. Last Stand was the last of the original expansions and added in a new team-based PvP mode that featured gear and stat normalization in an attempt to create an even playing field. The results were decidedly mixed on all of these expansions, but I think they were overall good additions to the game. As a silly little PvE nerd, I spent more time in survival PvE and Underground than anything else, but these did provide fun new ways to chase the endless grind as they were added. Survival is always a good time even without any loot, and I wish we got a standalone game mode at some point. Oh well. The first game continued on in this state for a while, and then wrapped things up with the 1.8 patch that introduced the West Side Pier and a new horde-based game mode to close out the first entry. By this point in time, things were pretty dismal in the PvP scene, and most folks had been locked into their chosen builds for quite some time. This set the stage perfectly for a sequel to come onto the scene and shake things up with entirely new systems and tweaks to improve the overall player experience. Enter Toby Chris's The Division 2 in early 2019. A brand new version of the game, with a new setting and set several months after the events of the first game, now based in the balmy summer down in Washington, D.C. You take control of a brand new agent who is stationed outside of DC defending a local settlement when an all-hands distress call is received from the nation's fallen capital. This sees you heading off to the White House in order to help re-establish control of the former headquarters of all of America. The Division 2 is a clear evolution of the first game in that it still leans heavily into its RPG-like mechanics and sees players endlessly chasing loot through repetitive missions and activities, with ever-increasing difficulty in order to provide new challenges to the best of the best. There is now an armor system in place, with renewable armor plates replacing the medkits of the first game, and a new signature weapon system that unlocks at level 30 that attempts to help define classes. It did not work, really, but it was clear from launch that the developers wanted to try and point this game into a more diverse direction than the DPS-focused meta of the first one. They also failed at this, but I guess skill builds are still somewhat viable, so you don't just have to chase the meta AR or SMG anymore. We won't go too deep into gear specifics, but the situation did lightly improve overall in this second outing. Once again, you will grow from level 1 all the way up to level 30 in the base game, transitioning into a world tier and gear score based grind at endgame with nothing new there overall. After hitting level cap, you would fall back on the same old grind as usual. This time helped out a bit by the new variation in gear such as brand sets and exotic weapons and armor. The brand sets were a new way to build mini gear sets by equipping 1, 2, and 3 pieces of matching armor to unlock unique perks, and gear sets from the first game made a return. These stylized sets of armor offered unique and strong talents for equipping multiple pieces at the cost of not really being able to stray from any one set if you want additional bonuses. Anyway, let me reiterate that we are not here today to deep dive individual gear, as preference will always win out to me over efficiency. That said, always be mindful of other people's time if you can in a game like this, but really, play however you want at the end of the day. Mini rant over. Thanks for hanging in there. I am personally much more familiar with the streets of Washington, D.C. compared to the setting of the first game, and special commendation needs to be given to the developers for their attention to detail when it comes to the Division 2's map. It does not have nearly as much character as the bleak winter setting we saw in NYC, but the swampy, overgrown state of D.C. is a work of art in its own right. You will eventually triumph over the new factions you face and uncover a sinister plot to overthrow what is left of the government by the nefarious forces of the Black Tusk. This went on and on for a bit, with some mild tweaks to the overall balance of the game, right up until the announcement of the first major DLC for the Division 2, Warlords of New York. This DLC saw a level cap increase up to 40, and a new progression system past this level cap that would provide small incremental increases all the way up from 1 to 1,000. And that was just where the benefits capped out as well, as I know a lot of you out there are way over shade level 1000 at this point. Woe be to our enemies, because y'all take this shit seriously. The return to NYC was a welcome shakeup to the game, and even initially saw some resolution to the story of Aaron Keener from the first entry. I did not mention him earlier, but Keener is a first-wave agent that went rogue and ended up in control of the device used to create the green poison, a CRISPR genetic printer that can generate diseases just like your dinky little HP printer at home. This was a pretty fitting end and a not-so-easy boss fight immediately upon release. With some slightly interesting story twist that leads us into the new seasonal format, it seemed that The Division 2 was settling into a comfortable format to ride out the next few years. Nothing lasts forever, sadly, and we saw a few different attempts at revitalizing the game via new seasonal models with new manhunts to provide a narrative structure to the grind. You aren't just running Roosevelt Island again for gear. Now you're chasing down intel on these new rogue agents that could even provide new skill variants once you work your way through their lieutenants. This led to some interesting developments, such as second wave agent Fei Lao being revealed as a rogue, but overall, it was a loose narrative meant to keep us interested while the developers really figured out what they wanted to do next. As of the time of writing this video, we do know that a third game has entered full development, and at least one of the planned spin-off games, The Division Heartland, was recently cancelled as well. Rest in peace, Heartland. I really hope that anything worthwhile was salvaged for The Division 3. Before we go deep down the rabbit hole of hopes and wishes for a threequel, I want to talk about the most recent announcement from Ubisoft and Massive regarding what I expect to be the full final year of support to The Division 2, and that is the introduction of seasonal characters. Now, I know that several games have used this model successfully, but I kind of agree with most of the sentiment that I have been seeing online, and that I would much rather continue playing with my agent that I started 5 years ago. I am going to leave it at that for now, and hopefully this will become a short moment that I can edit out later due to massive changing directions, but I won't hold my breath. If this really takes off for some reason, we can talk about it in a separate video. All of that aside, I honestly did not expect this game to get this much continued support over the years, considering how quickly they pivoted from the first game to the second. But what is live service but a long-term plan to take in as much cash as possible? And that's not as evil as people make it sound either, by the way. Businesses do need to make money to operate and create things, so it is what it is, I guess.
Not about money, it's about sending a message. Everything burns.
So, do you think The Division 2 has succeeded? I am not sure, honestly. I would be dishonest to call this a straight-up flop or failure, as there really are a ton of dedicated fans and players out there grinding it out and sitting at stupid high shade levels. I think some of the recent decisions do throw some shade onto an otherwise decidedly good game. Did I mention that they recently resurrected the main villain from the first game and the Warlords of New York expansion, Aaron Keener? Because they did. And then they even made Kelso go rogue by joining him. I am sure that this whole storyline is going somewhere, and the line between rogue and not rogue will continue to blur as the series moves forward. But once you start reviving previously killed characters, I do start to raise my eyebrows. Anyway, we will see what comes in the time between now and any news or previews of the next game, which I don't expect until at least 2025, and probably just a teaser then. Let's get into that very last thing that I mentioned back at the start, and that is what I would like to see in the sequel. I won't take too long. After all, I'm just another filthy casual compared to most of you, but be sure to let me know what you want to see or just how trash my ideas are down in the comments. My number one wish for the third game might even be a little controversial in this community, but I would like to see this game series lean hard into the massively multiplayer portion of its description. Give me an open world map space where I can encounter other agents out there putting in the work. The narrative has always acknowledged that there are other agents on our side, and this is how the matchmaking systems fit into the lore as well, but I want to come up on a squad actively taking over something like a control point and begin a flanking maneuver to assist them without the need to group up. There are probably a ton of balancing considerations that make this request absolutely insane to develop or do properly, but this is my video and I can dream if I want to. I have often heard people refer to a PvE-focused light zone that could fill this purpose, and I wouldn't be opposed to it only being a small portion of the map if that's what it takes. My number 2 wish would be for them to really lean into some of the other skills and possible roles to help flesh out group play. I want to be a healer or tank, and I would like new ways to do that other than just pushing a skill button and then going back to mag dumping into any enemy I see. I'm not pretending to be a game dev either, so if any of this seems like a ridiculous request, then it probably is. However, these are the things that pop into my mind, so why not share them here with you all? Let me do something crazy, like use a skill that adds nanobots to my bullets or something, and all of a sudden they can repair armor when I shoot friendlies with them. I know, magic nanobots and all that can be a bit cliche, but we already have respawning drones, turrets, and seeker mines, so don't at me over realism. Other than some gameplay tweaks and the already mentioned ideas, my biggest hope for the sequel is that they will launch with a more dedicated vision for how the in-game grind can be kept fresh and fun. I do always enjoy the story, but so many live service games get really caught up in that launch experience and what could be an amazing story, just to see player counts plummet once you end up in a repetitive loot grind with nothing exciting sitting off on the horizon. Stop trying to mimic what seems to be successful, and focus on the things that make us all fall in love to begin with. Or just say fuck it and go full Fortnite with referential skins and even crossover characters. Imagine it now. Optimus Prime and Rick Sanchez are retreating under heavy fire through the ruined streets of New York. They fire a signal flare to call an extraction as the camera pans out to see the Ninja Turtles, Powerpuff Girls, and even Sam Fisher all start to zero in on their position as their shade watches go red. There you go, The Division 3. Go make it, nerds.